Welcome back. Part 2 of Chapter 7. Now, Mary Ellen and her friend, Sarah Jane, are on horses, riding side saddle as her mom told her to do. Sarah Jane and I were on horseback one day, driving a small herd of cattle at the back of the train. It was another slow, quiet, warm afternoon. We were talking about the differences in cows once you got to know them. Take those two, Sarah Jane pointed at two black and white ones. They look about alike, but that one is lazy, and the other one is just plain ornery. That brown heifer of Mr. Grant's reminds me of Daisy, I told her, only she isn't as friendly. You should have seen how Daisy would butt her head at me if she wanted to be petted. We rode along in silence for a few minutes. My favorite cow of ours is the big red one that my daddy used to call Pink, Sarah Jane said. Now that cow had a mind of her own. My mama said she was opposed to going to Oregon. That very first morning after we left, she turned up missing. My daddy rode back a few miles, and don't you know? He found her heading for home just as fast as she could go? Pink did that 3 or 4 times. Then one morning, somewhere in Illinois, we lost her. My daddy thinks someone stole her, but my mama is sure she is home by now. Pink always was a sensible cow, she says. At that moment, I looked up to see 5 Indians riding right next to us. They were not in war paint. Their chests were bare, and their black hair was cut close to their scalps, except for something like a rooster comb on top, colored red. They sat stiff and solemn in their ponies, not trying to speak to us. What could they want? Again, my heart started thumping madly. I looked over at Sarah Jane. Underneath her faded yellow sunbonnet, her eyes were dark and very large. I knew she was as scared as I was. We were a fair distance behind the wagons, and no one else seemed to have seen the Indians. They kept riding along right next to us. One of their ponies was so close that I could plainly see its round, reddish-brown side, its rider's leather leggings, and brightly beaded moccasins. I didn't dare look up into that Indian's face. For a brief moment, I found myself marveling at how he could ride without a saddle or bridle. Now the Indians were talking amongst themselves. They made low, guttural sounds, gesturing. They seemed to be taking particular notice of the cattle we were driving. Maybe they meant to steal them. I need father, I thought. Now. I stared at the back of our wagon. If only he would look over his shoulder and see what was happening. Again my eyes met Sarah Jane's, and almost as if by unspoken agreement, we both urged our horses toward the wagon. Just then father turned around and saw the Indians. "Whoa!" he shouted to the oxen. Seeing them, the Indians halted too. For a long moment they seemed to hesitate, looking at each other. Then, laughing, they kicked their ponies and galloped away. My knees were shaking so hard I could barely stand as Sarah Jane and I slid down from our horses' backs. Without a backward look, she ran off toward her wagon. Father jumped down from the spring seat and gathered me into his arms. I felt like a trembling rabbit returned to its nest. "It's all right, honey," he murmured against my hair. "They are gone now. Everything is all right." Mother smiled down at me from the wagon. "Don't cry, Mary Ellen," she said. "You were very brave." Lavina was looking at me as if I had performed some heroic deed. Father's arms were strong around me. But though he kept comforting me, and Mother kept telling me how brave I had been, my knees refused to stop shaking. For days after that, Sarah Jane and I made sure we walked close to the wagons. End.